"Please, just make it quick," she said. But the rancher saw her wound and forgot the bounty. The sun was setting over the dry, endless plains of the west, casting long shadows across the land. The air was thick with dust, and the sounds of horses galloping were all but drowned out by the harsh wind. The heat of the day still lingered, but it was starting to cool, as the rancher, Jackson Cooper, made his way back home. His boots kicked up dirt as he rode his horse, his mind focused on the day's work.
Jackson wasn't the kind of man to take much notice of rumors.
The Wild West was full of stories, many of them exaggerated, and most of them never amounted to anything. But even he had heard the talk in town. The whispers about a dangerous woman on the run. Narration.
A bounty hunter, they said. She was worth a lot of money, and she was wanted for things that made the lawmen uneasy.
But Jackson didn't care about that. What interested him most was the quiet, the work, and the peace that he found in his everyday life on the ranch. His ranch had been passed down through generations, and Jackson was proud to take care of it. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always glamorous, but it was his. He had cattle to tend to, fences to repair, and miles of land to look after. But today, as he rode home, something felt different. Breath. The air felt heavier, and the familiar sounds of the land seemed quieter than usual. Jackson had been so used to the routine that anything out of the ordinary seemed strange to him. As he neared a bend in the trail, he saw something that made him stop. A figure, lying motionless on the ground, barely visible against the dirt and grass. His first instinct was to ignore it. It could be another traveler who had taken a rest, or, perhaps, a stray animal. But then something made him pull his reins. His eyes narrowed, and his heart skipped a beat. It was a woman. Jackson didn't know why he felt the need to approach her. Maybe it was the way she was lying there, so still, her face turned away from him. Or maybe it was the quiet desperation that seemed to hang in the air. Whatever the reason, he dismounted quickly and moved closer. She was barely conscious, her body covered in dust and blood. Her clothes were torn, and her face was pale, almost lifeless. Her breathing was shallow, and she seemed to be in pain, her hands clutching at her side, as if trying to hold something together. Jackson knelt beside her, his hands shaking slightly as he gently tried to lift her.
"Hey, you all right?"
he asked, his voice low but firm. The woman opened her eyes, and for a moment there was confusion in them, as if she didn't quite understand where she was. She tried to speak, but all that came out was a weak gasp. Jackson's heart sank as he saw the blood soaking her side. It wasn't just a scrape or a bruise. This was something serious. "Please," she gasped again, her voice barely a whisper. "Just make it quick." Jackson was taken aback. He had no idea who she was, but her words hit him harder than he expected. She looked like she was at the end of her rope, as if she had been through too much, and the thought of going on any further was more than she could bear. Without thinking, Jackson gently pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully. The weight of the situation suddenly pressed on him. This woman, whoever she was, needed help. Despite the rumors, despite the bounty hunters that had been chasing her, something inside him refused to leave her there to die alone. He swung her up onto his horse, his mind racing. He hadn't expected this kind of day. He wasn't a doctor and he didn't have the proper equipment to treat wounds like hers, but he knew he couldn't just let her die out here in the wild. The wind whipped around them as he spurred his horse forward, heading toward his ranch. The ride felt longer than it was. The silence between them was heavy, the only sound being the rhythmic thumping of the horse's hooves on the dirt. Jackson's mind kept returning to the woman's words. Make it quick. It was a strange request, one that didn't sit well with him. He didn't know what had brought her to this point, but he was sure it wasn't good. She was on the run, and whatever had happened to her, it had broken her in ways he couldn't yet understand. As they neared the ranch, Jackson's thoughts began to shift. He had heard the rumors, sure. People had said things about her. Bad things. But he wasn't interested in that. She needed help, and for now, that was enough for him. The ranch wasn't the place for questions like these. His job was to take care of what he had, and right now, that meant taking care of her. He guided the horse through the dirt path that led up to the homestead, his eyes scanning the area as he approached the house. There was no sign of anyone around. It was just him, his land, and the woman who had come into his life in the most unexpected way. Once at the house, Jackson gently helped her down from the horse, supporting her as best as he could. He could see that she was barely able to stand, her body trembling with weakness. She was in no condition to be alone, and Jackson knew he couldn't just leave her outside to rest. He took her inside, placing her carefully on the bed, his mind working fast. What was he supposed to do? He wasn't a doctor, and he didn't have any medical supplies to speak of, but he had been on the ranch long enough to know how to handle basic injuries. He had stitched up wounds before, but nothing like this. This was serious. He needed to stop the bleeding. Jackson went to his small storage room and grabbed what he could find, a clean cloth, some water, and a pair of scissors. He worked quickly, but gently, cutting away her torn clothes to get a better look at her wound. It was deep, way too deep for a simple fix. She needed more than he could offer here, but Jackson wasn't about to leave her alone. Not in this condition. As he cleaned the wound, the woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open again. She seemed to recognize him now, though her gaze was distant, lost in a haze of pain and confusion. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. Jackson paused, glancing down at her. He hadn't thought much about it until now, but the question was a valid one. He had no answers to offer her, and he had no idea what kind of trouble she was in. "I'm just a rancher," he said quietly. "To someone who's here to help." She stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Then, slowly, she seemed to relax, the tension leaving her body as she let herself drift back into unconsciousness. Jackson finished dressing the wound as best as he could, his thoughts racing. Who was this woman? Why was she here? And what kind of danger was she really in? For now, though, all he could do was watch over her. Yes, and as he sat there in the quiet of his ranch, the weight of the unknown pressing down on him, Jackson Cooper realized that this was just the beginning of a story he hadn't expected, one that would change everything. For both of them. Breaths. The next morning Jackson woke early, as he always did. The sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over the small ranch house. But today, the usual peaceful quiet was broken by something more urgent. The woman was still sleeping in the bed where he had placed her the night before, her breathing steady but shallow. Jackson couldn't shake the worry that weighed on him. He had done what he could with the limited supplies he had, but he knew the wound was serious. Grasp. She needed more help than he could provide, and the longer she stayed in that condition, the more dangerous it became. As he moved quietly around the house, Jackson's mind kept drifting back to the night before. He had heard the rumors about this woman, about the bounty on her head, but those thoughts seemed far away now. They didn't matter. All that mattered was getting her better. But she wasn't just a fugitive to him. She was a person in need, and Jackson had always believed in helping others when they needed it most. After making his morning coffee, he sat at the small table staring out the window. The wind had picked up, rustling the dry leaves in the trees around his property. The land was quiet, as it always was, and Jackson found comfort in that silence. But the silence inside the house felt different. It was heavy. It was full of questions he didn't have answers for. Who was this woman? Why was she so desperate? What had brought her to this point, lying in his bed, asking him to end her suffering? The more Jackson thought about it, the more he realized he didn't know anything about her. Her name, Lena, she had told him in the night, didn't offer him any clues. But there was something about her that made him want to protect her, even if he didn't understand her. The pain in her eyes the night before, the desperation in her voice, it had touched something deep inside him. Jackson wasn't one to shy away from hard work, and he knew this was no different. Taking care of her, getting her well again, was the right thing to do, even if it didn't make sense. He finished his coffee and stood up, making his way to the small barn on the side of the property. There, he gathered the few supplies he had left. More cloths, a clean bandage, some ointment, and a few other odds and ends. He had always kept his ranch well stocked, even if it wasn't for anything as serious as treating gunshot wounds. But he had to make do with what he had. As he headed back into the house, he found Lena still asleep. Her face was pale, her lips dry, but she was breathing easier now. Jackson set to work cleaning the wound again and trying his best to dress it more properly. Breath. As he worked, Lena stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, and she groaned softly in pain. Bree. Jackson stopped for a moment, taking a breath before continuing. He didn't want to hurt her more, but he knew it had to be done. "Hey, Lena," Jackson said softly, trying to get her attention. Her eyes opened, and she blinked at him, trying to focus on his face.
Where am I?"
she whispered, her voice weak.
"You're safe here,"
Jackson said, his voice calm. "I'm just cleaning up your wound. You've been through a lot." Lena's eyes flickered with confusion, and for a moment she seemed to struggle to remember what had happened. Her gaze wandered around the room, taking in her surroundings. I don't remember much," she whispered, a hint of fear in her voice. "I didn't think I'd make it this far." Jackson paused in his work, looking down at her. She was trying to sit up, her hands pushing against the mattress, but the pain in her side stopped her. She winced and let out a soft gasp, her face contorting with the effort. "Braskin." Jackson quickly moved to help her, gently guiding her back down into a lying position. "Take it easy," he said quietly. "Breaths. You're still hurt. Rest is what you need."
Lena's eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and gratitude, but she nodded slowly.
She relaxed back into the bed, closing her eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength. Jackson worked in silence, but he could tell she was trying to make sense of everything. Her mind was racing, her thoughts scattered, but she wasn't giving up. When he finished tending to the wound, Jackson stepped back, wiping his hands on a towel. He hadn't been able to stop the bleeding entirely, but the worst of it was over. Her body would need time to heal, and so would her mind. He had no idea how long it would take for Lena to recover, but he was willing to stay with her for as long as it took. "I'm sorry about all this," Lena said, breaking the silence. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but there was a rawness to it that Jackson couldn't ignore. "Don't apologize," he replied. "You didn't do this to yourself. You're just caught in something much bigger than you." Lena turned her head to look at him, her eyes searching his face. "I don't know if I can escape it," she said, her voice trembling. "They won't stop hunting me. I don't even know if I want to keep running. Jackson felt a tightness in his chest as he listened to her. He didn't know what kind of trouble she was in, but he could tell that the weight of it was crushing her. She had come so close to death he had seen it in her eyes, the resignation, the acceptance of her fate.
"You don't have to run anymore," Jackson said quietly. His words surprised even him.
He hadn't meant to say it, but it felt like the right thing.
You're safe here.
Bo, once going to find you. Lena's eyes locked onto his, and for the first time there was a flicker of hope in them. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Breaths. She didn't say anything, but Jackson could tell she was processing his words. She had been running for so long, and now she didn't have to anymore. For the first time, she was in a place where no one was chasing her, where she could just breathe and heal. They sat in silence for a while after that, the weight of their conversation lingering in the air. Jackson knew this wasn't going to be easy. There were still so many unknowns, and Lena's past wasn't something she could just leave behind. But for now, all he could do was give her a chance to rest, to heal, and to maybe, just maybe, start over. As the day wore on, Jackson spent most of his time keeping busy. He worked on the ranch, tending to the cattle and fixing the fence that had been damaged during a recent storm. Every now and then he would glance back at the house, checking on Lena. She hadn't moved much, but he could see she was still struggling with the weight of everything she had been through. By evening, Lena seemed a little stronger. She was sitting up, her head resting against the pillows as she watched Jackson from the bed. When he brought her a bowl of soup, she thanked him quietly, her voice still soft but more steady than it had been before. "Thank you for helping me," she said after a moment. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along."
"Just doing what anyone would do," he said. "But you've still got a long way to go."
"You rest up, and we'll figure out what comes next." The sun set in the distance, casting a soft golden glow over the ranch. Jackson sat down at the table, his mind still working over the events of the day. He hadn't expected any of this, but it seemed like fate had a different plan. And as he looked over at Lena, sitting quietly on the bed, Jackson realized that his life, too, was about to change. Death. He didn't know how or why, but somehow he knew he couldn't let her go. She had been lost, but now, for the first time, she had found a place to stay, a place where she could heal and maybe, just maybe, begin again. The days passed slowly, and Jackson settled into a routine. Each morning he would wake before the sun, check on Lena, and go about his work on the ranch. He was used to the solitude of the land, but now there was something different. There was someone else to care for, someone who needed him, even if she hadn't asked for his help. Lena had begun to improve. Her wound, though still painful, was healing, and the color had returned to her face. She wasn't as weak as she had been the first few days, and she was starting to move around the house more. Jackson had set up a small chair next to the window for her, and she often sat there, staring out at the vast stretch of land. It was as though she was searching for something, but Jackson couldn't quite figure out what. One morning, after checking the cattle and making sure the fences were secure, Jackson found Lena sitting by the window again. She had a faraway look in her eyes, and for a moment he thought she hadn't noticed him standing there. "You're getting stronger," Jackson said softly as he approached her. Lena turned to look at him, offering a small smile.
"Thanks to you," replied quietly, her voice still soft but filled with a certain strength now.
"I don't know what I would have done without your help." Jackson didn't respond immediately. He didn't need the praise, but it was clear that the kindness he had shown her had started to mean something to her. Best. She wasn't used to being helped, not in the way he had helped her. The life she had lived had taught her to rely on no one, to trust no one. But here, in this quiet corner of the world, she was starting to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope.
"You're welcome," Jackson finally said, giving her a brief nod.
But you still need rest. Don't push yourself too hard. Lena's eyes flickered, and she looked away from him. Out the window again. I don't want to just sit here forever, she said, her voice tinged with frustration. I need to do something. Jackson understood. She had been running for so long, and now that she was safe, she didn't know how to just be. It was a foreign feeling for her, and Jackson knew that. He had seen it in her eyes, the desperation, the restlessness that came with being hunted for so long. It's taking it slow as the best thing you can do right now, Jackson said gently, sitting across from her. You've been through a lot, Lena. You don't need to rush things.
Lena looked at him, her expression softening.
I know, she said quietly, but it's hard, you know. After everything I've been through, just sitting here like this, it feels like I'm wasting time.
You're not wasting time, Jackson reassured her.
You're healing. That's the most important thing right now.
For a moment there was silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Jackson could see the conflict in Lena's eyes, the battle between wanting to move forward and needing to let go of the past. She had been running for so long, always looking over her shoulder, always wondering who was after her next. I don't know how to stop running, she whispered, more to herself than to him. It's all I've ever done. Jackson's heart went out to her. He could see the weight of her past, the scars it had left on her. But there was something about her, something strong, something real, that made him believe she could find peace if she was given the chance. You're here now, Jackson said, his voice steady. And you don't have to run anymore. You can stay here as long as you need. Lena met his gaze, her eyes searching his face as if looking for some kind of reassurance. Jackson wasn't sure if she was ready to believe him, but he meant every word. This place, his ranch, was the one thing he had that he could offer. It wasn't much, but it was home, and he wanted her to know she was welcome here. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a brilliant shade of orange, Jackson came back to the house to find Lena sitting outside on the porch. She was staring out at the land, the wind gently tugging at her hair. She seemed lost in thought, her mind far away, and for a moment, Jackson just watched her from the doorway. Beautiful, isn't it? He said, stepping out onto the porch and leaning against the railings. Lena nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at her lips.
Yeah, it is, she replied. It's peaceful. That's what I like about it, Jackson said. It's quiet.
Just you and the land. Lena looked at him, her expression softening. Bah, I don't know how to live like this, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I've never known peace like this. I've always been running, always looking over my shoulder. Jackson could hear the sadness in her voice, the weariness that came from years of living a life that was anything but peaceful. He knew that the road ahead for her wouldn't be easy. Healing wasn't just about physical wounds. It was about the emotional scars, too. Why I dive to what you have taught by now. This corresponded despite herself. And those were the hardest to mend.
You'll get there, Jackson said, his voice full of quiet certainty.
Bray. One step at a time. Lena nodded but didn't say anything more. She had been through so much, and Jackson understood that it would take time for her to trust, to let herself heal fully. But he wasn't going anywhere. He would be there for her, as long as she needed him. As the days passed, Lena began to settle into a new routine. She would help Jackson around the ranch when she could, doing small tasks that didn't require much effort. Breaths. Slowly, she began to open up more, telling him bits and pieces of her story. It wasn't much, just glimpses of a life filled with pain, betrayal, and loss. But it was enough for Jackson to understand that she wasn't just a fugitive. She was a woman who had been dealt a difficult hand and was now trying to find a way out of the mess she had made. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, Lena looked over at Jackson. There was something in her eyes, a softness that hadn't been there before. "I never thanked you properly," she said, her voice sincere, "for everything you've done for me." "You don't need to thank me. You're here now, and that's enough." Lena hesitated for a moment, then reached out, her hand resting lightly on his. "But I do thank you," she said softly. "You saved my life, and I'll never forget that." Jackson didn't know what to say to that. He wasn't the kind of man who needed praise, but hearing her words touched him in a way he hadn't expected. He looked down at her hand and then back at her face, her eyes full of gratitude and something else, something deeper. "I didn't save you," he said quietly.
You saved yourself.
You're the one who got yourself through all of this.
Lena smiled, a real smile this time, one that reached her eyes. "Maybe," she said.
"But you were there when I needed someone, and that means more than you'll ever know." For the first time since she had arrived at the ranch, Lena seemed to be at peace. She wasn't running anymore. She was healing, and for the first time in a long while she allowed herself to believe that she could have a future, one without fear, one where she didn't have to constantly look over her shoulder. And as Jackson watched her, he realized something. This wasn't just about him helping her. This was about two people finding each other at the right moment, when they needed it the most. And maybe, just maybe, this quiet ranch in the middle of nowhere was where they both belonged. The days were turning into weeks, and as the seasons began to shift, so did the atmosphere at the ranch. The air had become cooler. The colors of fall were spreading across the trees, and Jackson noticed the change in Lena, too. She was no longer the woman who had stumbled into his life, broken and desperate. Slowly but surely she was finding her footing again. Lena was healing. Physically, her wound had nearly closed up, leaving behind only a faint scar as a reminder of how close she had come to losing everything.
But it wasn't just her body that was healing.
It was the weight of her past, the burden she had carried for so long, that was starting to lighten.
Every day, she seemed to open up a little more, sharing pieces of herself she had kept hidden for years.
One afternoon, while Jackson was fixing a fence near the far end of the property, Lena came out to join him. She had been working around the house, tending to the small garden she had started, but today she had a different look on her face. She was more focused than usual, more determined. Jackson paused and watched as she walked toward him, the same strength in her step that he had noticed in her before. "You need help with that?" Lena asked, her voice steady as she stood next to him. Jackson raised an eyebrow. "With the fence? You're welcome to try, but I don't think it's as easy as it looks."
Lena smiled slightly, a look of playful challenge crossing her face.
I'm not afraid of hard work. Besides, it's been a while since I've done anything useful.
Jackson could see the eagerness in her eyes, the desire to prove to herself that she was more than her past. He didn't hesitate. "All right, then. Let's see what you've got." Over the next few hours, they worked together, side by side. Lena proved to be more than capable, handling the tools with ease and determination. As they worked, there was a comfort between them. It wasn't like the silence that used to hang in the air. This was a silence that spoke of understanding, of two people who had found something in each other that had been missing for a long time.
While they worked, they talked.
About the land, about their lives, about their pasts. Lena had started to share more of her story, and Jackson had listened quietly, offering only his presence and patience. It wasn't easy for her to talk about. But little by little she began to open up. She had grown up in a small town, surrounded by family and friends, but life had quickly become complicated when she had gotten involved with the wrong people. Her escape had come at a price. She had left everything behind, including the people she once trusted, and now she was left running from the consequences of her choices. "I never thought I'd find peace again," Lena admitted one afternoon as they took a break. They sat on the porch, looking out over the land, the breeze tugging at their clothes. "I didn't even know what peace was. Not really. But here, it's different." Jackson nodded, watching her carefully. "Peace isn't something you can just find. It's something you have to allow yourself to feel," he said, his voice quiet but full of truth. "And sometimes it takes time to get there." Lena looked at him, a soft smile playing at the corners of her lips.
Maybe that's the hardest part. Allowing myself to feel it.
Breaths. Jackson knew that she was speaking the truth. He could see it in her eyes, the hesitation, the fear of truly letting go of the life she had known. But he also saw the strength within her, the same strength that had gotten her this far, and he believed that if anyone could find peace, it was her. As the weeks passed, Lena became more comfortable with the rhythm of ranch life. She helped Jackson with whatever needed doing, whether it was cleaning out the barn, fixing up the fences, or simply sitting with him as he worked, offering company when he needed it most. She had found a role here, and that role wasn't just about being someone who needed help. It was about being part of something, a team, a home. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow across the horizon, Jackson and Lena sat on the porch again. They had finished their work for the day, and now all that was left was the quiet. The sounds of the land, the wind rustling through the trees, the distant calls of birds, and the faint murmur of the creek nearby. It was a peaceful evening, the kind that Jackson had grown used to over the years, but this time it felt different. Lena turned to Jackson, her face thoughtful. "Bright, do you ever wonder how things could have been different?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jackson glanced at her, his expression softening. "All the time," he admitted. "But the past is the past. We can't change it, no matter how hard we try. What matters is what we do with the time we have now." Inspiration, her gaze distant. "I know, Brett. Sometimes it feels like I can't escape it. Like my past is always going to be there, chasing me." "It doesn't have to chase you anymore," Jackson said, his voice steady. "You're here. You've got a chance to start over. That's more than most people ever get." Lena looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty.
Do you really think so? Jackson smiled, his gaze warm and reassuring.
"I know so." The conversation faded into silence again, but this time it was a comfortable silence. One that didn't feel heavy, but rather full of potential. Right. They were both here, in this moment together, and for the first time Lena allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could leave her past behind and find a future that was hers to shape. As the weeks turned into months, the weather grew colder, and the first signs of winter began to settle in. The ranch was quieter during the long evenings, but there was still work to be done. Jackson and Lena had grown into a rhythm of their own, a balance between the tasks at hand and the time spent together, talking, laughing, and learning more about each other. One cold evening, as snow began to fall softly outside, Jackson found himself sitting by the fire with Lena, the warmth of the flames making the room feel cozy and safe. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in their thoughts, until Lena spoke again, her voice soft but steady. "I think I'm ready," she said quietly. Jackson turned to look at her, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Ready for what?" "To move forward," she explained, her eyes meeting his. "To stop running. To let go of the past." Jackson felt his heart swell with pride and relief. It wasn't easy, but Lena had done it. She had taken the first step toward healing, toward forgiving herself. He knew that there would still be difficult days ahead for her. But this was the turning point. "You've already taken that step," Jackson said, his voice full of warmth. "I'm proud of you, Lena." Lena smiled, the weight of her past lifting from her shoulders, if only for a moment. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said softly. "You don't need to thank me," Jackson replied with a small grin. "You've done all the hard work yourself." They sat together in silence once more, the crackling of the fire filling the space between them. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside the ranch, it was warm. It was peaceful. And for the first time in a long time, Lena truly believed that she could stay here, that this could be her home, the place where she had found her peace. The winter had fully arrived, blanketing the land with snow and turning the world outside into a silent, peaceful white wonderland. The ranch had become a quiet haven, the sounds of everyday life softened by the thick, still air. Inside, the warmth of the fire crackled, and Jackson and Lena spent their days in a comfortable routine, a rhythm that felt like home. Lena had come a long way from the woman who had first arrived at Jackson's ranch. She was no longer the broken, desperate fugitive who had stumbled onto his land. Now she was someone who had found her place, someone who had begun to heal. The woman who had once feared for her life now woke up each morning with the confidence to face the day, and Jackson could see the change in her. Breaths, she had become more than just the person he had helped. She had become a partner, someone who worked beside him, who shared in the small joys of life on the ranch. Every day they worked together, tending to the cattle, repairing things that had broken during the harsh winter months, or even just sitting in the barn, talking about anything and everything. And in all these quiet moments, Jackson realized that this was what it meant to truly live. It wasn't about the struggles of the past or the fear of what might come next. It was about the present, the here and now, and he was finally learning to embrace it fully. One afternoon, while they were working on the ranch, Jackson paused to look around at the land that had once seemed so vast and lonely. Now it felt full, complete. He glanced over at Lena, who was busy hammering a nail into the wood, her brow furrowed in concentration. There was a quiet strength in the way she worked, a determination that made Jackson proud. "You're doing good!" Jackson called out, his voice carrying across the yard. Lena paused and looked up, offering a small smile. "I've had good teachers," she said with a wink. Jackson chuckled, shaking his head. "I don't know about that, but you've definitely picked things up quickly." Lena's smile faded slightly, and she put the hammer down, walking over to where Jackson was standing. "Jackson, I've been thinking," she began, her voice hesitant. He turned to face her, his expression curious. "About what?" Lena took a deep breath. About the future. I know we've talked about it before, but now that I've been here for a while, I'm starting to feel like I'm finally ready to move forward. I don't want to keep hiding from my past, and I don't want to keep running. Breaths. I want to build something here. with you. He had always known that Lena had the potential to create something of her own, but hearing her say it out loud made something stir inside him. He could see the conviction in her eyes, the same conviction that had brought her through all of the hardships she had faced. "You're already building something here, Lena," he said, his voice steady but full of meaning. "We're building it together." Lena looked down at the snow-covered ground for a moment, collecting her thoughts. "But I need to know that I'm not just running away from everything. I want to face my past, not just bury it. I want to be someone I can be proud of." Jackson understood. He had known from the start that Lena had a past, one that she couldn't escape no matter how far she ran. But the fact that she was willing to face it now, after everything she had been through, spoke volumes about how far she had come. "You're not running anymore," Jackson said softly. "You're right where you need to be, and you'll figure out the rest, one step at a time." Lena smiled, her eyes glistening with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "I hope so. I really do." The conversation lingered in the air, and Jackson could see that Lena was still processing everything, still coming to terms with the fact that she had found something she could hold on to. But he also knew that this was part of the journey for her. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would still be days when the weight of her past would make her feel like running again. But Jackson believed in her, and he knew that, with time, she would learn to forgive herself. As winter began to loosen its grip on the land, and the first signs of spring started to appear, Jackson and Lena began to make plans for the future. They talked about expanding the ranch, planting new crops, and perhaps even building a small barn to house more cattle. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. And as they discussed these plans, Jackson couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment, knowing that Lena was no longer just surviving. She was living. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared in the sky, Lena sat on the porch, looking out at the land.
"Oh! Wow! Wow!"
"You know," Lena said quietly, her voice soft but steady, "I never thought I would be here. Not like this. I thought my life was over, that I had messed everything up beyond repair. But now, I see things differently. You've made it through a lot, Lena, and you're still standing. That says something." Lena nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I don't know what the future holds, but for the first time in a long time, I'm not afraid to face it." Jackson watched her closely, his gaze full of warmth. "You don't have to do it alone," he said softly. "You never will." Lena looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet kind of gratitude. "I know," she whispered. "I'm not alone anymore." The night stretched on, the sounds of the night creatures filling the air, but the two of them sat in comfortable silence. It wasn't often that words were needed between them. They had both found something here on the ranch, something that went beyond simple survival. They had found a home, a place where they could heal, a place where they could grow, and a place where they could face the future together. As the days turned into weeks and the snow slowly melted away, Jackson knew that this was only the beginning. The ranch would continue to grow, as would Lena. And as the seasons changed, so would they both. The past might have shaped them, but it didn't have to define them. Together, they would build a future, one step at a time. And no matter what challenges came their way, Jackson knew they would face them together.